Good morning. Thank you guys for that song. Our speaker today has taught English and Humanities for more than 25 years. His poetry has been published in several literary journals. His collections, Letters Drawn in Water, was published by Pecan Grove Press. He has done dozens of readings, most recently as a juried poet at the Houston Poetry Fest 2014. And he recently completed initial certification as a member of the Texas Master Naturalist program. I asked to introduce Jerry today because I've been volunteering with him for about a year now at the Exploration Green Conservancy in Clear Lake. We've been working in the tree nursery there together. One of our core values here at Oasis is meaning comes from making a difference. And from his years as an educator to his dedication as a volunteer, I think that Jerry really represents this core value exceedingly well. So hopefully you'll join me in welcoming Jerry Hamby.
See if I have better luck with the technology. Thank you, Brian. I'm here today because of Brian. Initially, as he indicated, we met at Clear Lake. Both had a mutual interest in being outside and, as he said, making a difference, contributing to the community. And I want to thank Mike, too. What an honor to be asked to speak to this group. I've been really looking forward to this. My association with the Texas Master Naturalist program has allowed me to make amazing discoveries about the Houston area. I've lived here for more than 25 years, and only in the last year have I discovered just how many places there are to go, to be, to work. And the kind of lens that I'm going to give you today is looking for these wonders specifically through the Texas Master Naturalist program. Before I leave this first slide, I'm going to point at that little dragonfly on the woman's cap. That is the icon of the Texas Master Naturalist program. This is a fairly new program I just learned about 5 years ago. And that little dragonfly shows a healthy ecosystem. And one of the things Brian and I both noticed when we began working that tree nursery is shortly after a wetland nursery was installed just a few yards away, and you can be out there in the middle of the summer, and it's sweltering, and there's water all around us, and we don't see mosquitoes. And the reason we don't see mosquitoes is because of those dragonflies. And these ecosystems work very, very nicely together. That's right. I have photographs that I took last fall as part of my training from different parks and natural areas around the Houston area. All but two of these are photos I took to document this extraordinary experience that I had. This is taken at the Katy Prairie, the Indian Grass Preserve. And those are my classmates, an amazing group of people. I was really intimidated when I started this program because I have no science background. As Brian indicated, I teach English and Humanities at a community college, and that's what I know, that's what I do. And when I was sitting in this classroom with 20 other people, horticulturalists, biologists, professors, and I had one biology class in college 30 years ago, and I knew nothing. And one of the things the trainers made very clear to us is this is for everybody. And I have learned an extraordinary amount, mostly from these amazing people I worked with. I'm often asked 3 basic questions. First of all, what is a master naturalist? Great question. How does a person become one? And this is my favorite. So what do you do when you become a master naturalist? It's not like you have a little license you pull out and say, see. I'm always a little nervous about even calling myself a master naturalist. I know so little. I prefer to think of myself as a member of the program, and I'm constantly learning, just as my students are. But I want to address these questions briefly. A master naturalist, or a naturalist more broadly, is a student of natural history. You're basically examining plants, you're examining animals in their environment, and the emphasis is on observation. You can see that plant press in the middle of the screen. We collected specimens to help us better understand them and the relationships between them, like the relationship between that grasshopper and that beautiful prairie grass. And over on the right-hand side, you'll see a shell for a whelk. I didn't realize that there was a state shell. And there it is, this left-handed whelk. This photo was taken at Sheldon Lake State Park. The mission of the Master Naturalist program is basically to provide a cadre of people who can educate, reach out, and make a difference in preserving that natural environment around them. There are 42 chapters in the state. The program started in 1998 with a small chapter in San Antonio and expanded out. And what has happened is every year or 2 years, a new chapter will come on board, and there are thousands and thousands of volunteers putting in volunteer hours, making a huge difference in the environment around them. The training is a little bit intensive, and I put this off for a while because I wasn't sure, on top of my full-time job, if I wanted to take on the responsibility of 50 hours, which was about the amount of training that I had to log last fall, plus the volunteer hours, plus advanced training. But it was the kind of thing that when I finished, I was sad that I no longer had my Tuesday nights to go to class. To be an active member in the program, the recertification requires an additional 40 hours of volunteer service plus 8 hours of advanced training. This photo was taken by one of my classmates, Dana Harper, with his iPhone, and it captures just this beautiful setting. This is at Galveston Island State Park. I never realized until we went down there for an all-day field trip just how amazingly diverse the island is, with very distinct 4 zones of growth. And this is on the bayside, and you can see that green net over there. That's a seining net, and we use that to scoop up specimens and then study them and talk about what we learned, guided by some volunteers who work in that park. That's me, by the way, with a funny little hat and the sling on the back. It was funny because through this program, there are only maybe 3 or 4 pictures of me because I was the one with the camera. One guy kept calling me the point-and-shoot guy. There are 2 ways to do the training, if some of you are interested. And I brought my own little brochures. After we're finished today, if anyone wants, there are enough here for everybody. These just give you the website and contact information if you're curious about the program and want to be part of it yourself. The training for the spring began last month, and it runs through May. And unfortunately, for the longest time, the only way you could get certified within our chapter, the Gulf Coast chapter, was to do it during the week. And of course, most of us work, and that simply was impossible. A few of the people who went through the training elsewhere at night eventually convinced the chapter, we need to have a way for people who work to do it. And so what they did is they introduced the type of training I went through, which is Tuesday evenings, mid-August through the end of October, with 5 Saturdays scattered in there for field trips. There is a fee associated with this, and it's mainly for the curriculum. I almost brought my binder full of curriculum, but I thought it might scare people away. It's huge. And the first night we went in for the training, I saw this monstrous binder, and I thought, oh, there's no way I'm going to get through this. And what we did was we'd read about 40 to 60 pages every week, and then someone would come in and expand our understanding of it with more in-depth information. There was a lot of classroom instruction, as I indicated. That's Jaime Gonzalez, who is the director for education through the Katy Prairie. One of the things I didn't realize until I worked through this program is just how extensively the prairie system throughout the Gulf Coast region was. If we had stood on this site 150 years ago and looked around 360 degrees, we probably wouldn't see a single tree. And that was a really amazing thought to me. What we would have seen would have been prairie grasses and all kinds of beautiful flowers that went along with that system. What you can see in this image is really only half of this banner. That's a prairie grass that's about 3 feet tall, and what Jaime told us is the root system went down 9 feet. And that deep root system allows it to survive drought. It also allows it to absorb floodwaters. We have lost more than 99% of the prairies on the Gulf Coast. And if you've heard of the Katy Prairie, and I know you have, it's the most extensive prairie system that's been preserved or reestablished. But the beauty of this is there are prairies all over the Houston area. One of the most interesting and newest is at MD Anderson. One of my classmates is actually the person in charge of that, David Reniger. A building was demolished. The plan was initially to put in a traditional green park, and what happened was they decided, let's put in a prairie instead. And so we have this beautiful, thriving prairie there. Okay, most of what we did that was meaningful to me involved the field trips, 5 of them, as I indicated, looking at these various ecoregions that I list up here. Texas has 11 ecoregions. 5 of them we border on or are in the center of. And so Houston's a very dynamic area in ecological terms. One of the places we went was Goodrich Jones Forest. This is managed by the Texas A&M Forestry Service. And it is primarily a place, from my perspective, to preserve an endangered bird called the red cockaded woodpecker. And if you look at the image on the right, you can see these holes and that sap dripping down from them. These birds spend their lives doing nothing more than creating hole from tree to, they just go around, new hole, new hole, new hole, so that they have places to go if the tree dies or if some other critter moves in, and they can nest there. And it's a specific kind of pine tree, usually the shortleaf or the longleaf pine, that allows that sap to come down that protects those openings from other animals. In this forest, it's more than 1,000 acres, is surrounded by suburban sprawl, and it was in danger of being developed if it had been sold about 7 or 8 years ago. But a ground roots movement through that community saved it to maintain its very vital part of this ecosystem. By the way, that little plant on the lower left is an American beautyberry. You've probably seen them. Did you know they're edible? Good for you, Wayne. Wayne eats them. One of my classmates was a forager, and I remember this was the first time we went out. He held out his hand and said, "Eat this." And I thought, "Are you kidding me?" He said, "No, eat it, trust me." And he popped them in his mouth, and I did too. They have kind of a sandy texture and just lightly sweet. As I indicated, I learned the most from my classmates, and David would constantly feed us things, or try to. Another park that's north of Houston is Jesse Jones Park and Nature Center. This is north of Intercontinental. And I can't recall the bird offhand, but there's a very, very rare bird there that people are known to fly into Houston if they have a layover, allow time to go out there just to see that bird, to put it on their list. We went out there seining. It's right along Spring Creek, and so you have this forested area, you have bayous, you can see these cypress trees and the knees coming up out of the water, and we were seining for freshwater shrimp and just all kinds of interesting little microcosmic organisms. And we brought them back into a classroom and examined them. We tested the oxygen levels in the water. You can see that table out there where we have little kind of laminated charts to figure out what it is we were looking at and what we were supposed to take from it. I have to admit, the place I was least looking forward to was one of my absolute favorites, and this is Sheldon Lake. Sheldon Lake State Park is just a little-known jewel on the eastern side of Houston. Have you been there since they've reopened on the north side? For the longest time, you had to cross these incredibly dangerous railroad tracks to get into the park. Well, they've rerouted to the north, so you drive through the prairie. This was an area that was used for agriculture for the longest time. I mean, it was initially cordoned off by the U.S. government to provide water during the World War II years, and then it was turned into farmland, and then eventually turned over to the state of Texas. And in the last 10 to 12 years, there's been an extensive movement to reestablish the prairie. And what you're looking at on that boardwalk image on the far upper left is a restored prairie. And twice a year, there are huge events to plant new plants throughout. It's an incredible experience. There's one coming up in April I'll tell you more about in a minute. But there's also this tower, and the kids who go out there for field trips love this because they get to climb up that 4-story tower and look out onto this space. It's a free state park, too, so if you ever get a chance to go out there, especially if you can get a ranger to take you out on a tour, you will learn so much about those plants. The Katy Prairie, as I indicated, is probably the largest and most well-known of the prairies. There are different preserves throughout the Katy Prairie. This one is one that is gated and is only available by tours. And one of the reasons is this is a remnant, and the prairie remnant is the real deal original thing. It's not restored. What you're looking at is a prairie the way it was naturally. You also get a sense about why there were no trees unless you were along waterways 150 years ago. Anybody have an idea why there were no trees in the prairie? Beavers, that's good. It's actually fire. And there's a natural cycle. Every 6 or 7 years, the fire would wipe out all the trees. And what that did, you remember those long roots that were down below the ground, they could live through that, and the animals would burrow under what the fire went over. It's a natural cycle, that's 6 or 7 years. And so it knocked off that extreme growth. In fact, Hamby, that's him in the red or orange shirt, was telling us he was trying to arrange with the owners of this land who allowed the Katy Prairie Conservancy to oversee it. He said, we need to do a burn in here because all those trees are encroaching and it makes it more likely there will eventually be a fire. That log he was rolling over, he said, let's go find us some brown recluses. We were disappointed. We didn't get to find any. He said, somebody's already turned this log. They've left. But that's what he was looking for. You can see him with that net. I mean, and that first slide I showed you, there was a little walking stick on his hand, the Bruins walking stick. And it was funny. He said, somebody tell me, what is the sex of this insect? And I thought, how on earth do you tell the sex of an insect? It was actually the species, a Bruins walking stick, reproduces asexually. Parthenogenesis, that's a hard word for me to remember, which means virgin birth. So you want truth of virgin birth? Well, there it is. Throughout this program, we were constantly being challenged with questions. Somebody point to a line of trees and tell me, what do you observe? And I thought, a bunch of trees? But somebody, usually several people, had answers, and so I learned so much just watching. Our final field trip was to Galveston Island State Park, and the volunteers there actually had us working on the bay side, and then we went over to the Gulf side, and we found very different fish and other interesting little creatures, crabs and case worms, and oh my gosh, my head was just spinning. There was so much information. I went to a conference last fall, and the person who was giving the keynote said that whenever he goes through ecological training, his wife has to learn it with him, and so he would go home and tell her this stuff. My wife Susan is here today, and she had to hear me go through all the time. I go home and say, this is what I learned today. And she kept saying I was like Tigger. It's like, enough. That image of the sand dunes gives you an idea of just how dynamic and resilient our ecosystems are. After Hurricane Ike, and the island of Galveston, of course, was just totally devastated, all the visible life in that fragile, that's the buffer right between the Gulf in the backside of the island. That was wiped out. There was nothing there but sand and not a whole lot of it. And the state of Texas came in and said, we're just going to let this go. This park doesn't exist anymore, basically. And a group of volunteers with the park and Texas Master Naturalist chapter, the Galveston Bay chapter, said, we're not going to let that happen. And what you see with those beautiful, thriving plants is a reestablishment of an ecosystem and then letting it just take off on its own. And so I was here in 2014, 6 years after, and it was already almost fully reestablished. And it was an amazing thing to see. We just scooped up all these little creatures. We looked at them. We talked about them. I want to briefly just mention something about the advanced training option, because you can do advanced training going to workshops. My wife and I went to a rain barrel workshop last week in Baytown and came out with 2 big rain barrels we're going to install in our backyard. But you can also get more formal training. There's a state conference every October, and what we did is we had hands-on, ranger-led activities, walking through the woods, learning about invasive species like this water hyacinth you see in that bucket down in the lower left. And also I learned to make bee houses, and those little bamboo reeds, those tubes, are going to be homes for solitary bees, and that's the majority of our bees around here, these little solitary bees that pollinate. It was a great experience. I've been going to professional conferences for over 30 years. This is the first time I went to a professional conference and actually went to every single session. And one session ended at 10 at night. I've never learned so much in 3 days. And it's sponsored by Texas Parks and Wildlife and AgriLife. Those are the 2 sponsors of the program, and they provide us with curriculum. They provide us with teachers. They are very generous with their time. The other component, of course, as Brian talked about working next Marsh and Green, is our volunteer service. This is another picture of Sheldon Lake. This is the plant-a-thon last October, and what you had was about 100 people of all ages. There were, little 10-year-old kids, and there was one man in his 70s in a wheelchair and slogging through that mud, planting prairie plants. And I was there to photograph the event, and it was an amazing operation, 4 hours, 2,500 plants put in the ground. And they had that thing down like clockwork. And the sky cooperated with me that day. I always hate it when I go out to photograph and I have this blue sky. It's like the most dull thing ever. But I had this beautiful, perfect sky so I could get low and get those clouds. This is the next volunteer. Actually, Sheldon Lake has volunteer activities every week, twice a week. But they have 2 major events. And if anyone's interested in signing up for this, by the way, I have cards if anybody wants to snag my email address. I can send you any of this information, but this is the form for the next event. They call it Green the Prairie in the spring and the plant-a-thon in the fall. They're essentially the same kind of event. You plant for 4 hours, and if you hang around long enough, you'll get a T-shirt and pizza and meet a lot of amazing people. Just quickly, some of the other volunteer events that I took part in. There are pocket prairies in Herman Park. The training that I took in the fall is in a community center, not unlike this one, right on the edge of Herman Park. And the Gulf Coast chapter established these pocket prairies about 5-6 years ago. And we were in charge of redefining the paths going through one of them and weeding and taking out invasives. The woman in the lower right is Mary Edwards, who is in charge of the AgriLife wetland plant nursery at Exploration Green in Clear Lake. And it's an amazing facility that opened last summer, and she expects to have this up to 100% capacity by this summer. She has 10 water tanks with just all manner of amazing plants in there. She has volunteer work every Thursday morning. over the Christmas break, I worked with them one day, and as always, I learned from these people. You'll recognize Brian there. And notice his advertising. Look at that shirt he's wearing in the upper. It's Houston Oasis. I have to say, every time Brian has been out there almost every day we have a work day, he always wears his Houston Oasis shirt. In fact, he and Philip, I guess a couple of weeks ago when we were moving trees, both had them, and I got a beautiful picture of the backside with the core values mission statement, and I put it up on my Facebook page so everybody could see that. Sure. Anyway, we work second Saturdays of the month. Our next work day is March 14th, and we're typically there from 8 to noon on those Saturdays. We also occasionally do second Sundays. It just depends on what we have going. Exploration Green is a 178-acre park. If any of you have ever been to Clear Lake and have seen the old Clear Lake City Golf Course, this is the one that the original NASA employees played golf. There's a whole long story. I could spend 2 hours telling you the story about Exploration Green, but it has been turned over to the Clear Lake City Water Authority. It is now part of a conservation easement that protects it forever. And there are plans for 12 years to develop this out into an amazing space. The name Exploration Green takes itself from the Discovery Green. You're all familiar with Discovery Green, just to kind of show the import of this. But it's going to be a place with hiking trails and bike trails and native plants down in the water. It will retain water from over flooding. The problem is we've been held up on the development by a group of citizens who want to preserve the golf course as it is. They think it's a green space right now. And I look at that and say it's a dead green zone. There's nothing growing there other than just the basic sod and occasional wildflowers when the mowers will let those go. So we're behind, and we have these incredible trees. We have almost 1,400 trees, and we needed to start putting them in the ground. And so what we did is we found a safe corner that's not going to be under development, and we spent one day moving 30-gallon trees. Those are very large. And what we did over the course of 2 weekends is put those 46 trees in the ground. We have another 46 to 50 that need to go in the ground, and we're still trying to determine the best way of dealing with those. We learned a lot from the gentleman on the right who's holding that tree trunk. That's Barry Ward, who's the executive director of Trees for Houston. My, what an encyclopedic knowledge this man has of how to handle trees, and he's always willing to try new methods. But he showed us the correct ways to plant these trees and to care for them. This slide just gives you the update about the volunteer work at Exploration Green. And look at that, there's this Houston Oasis shirt, just as I predicted. Okay, I began today by saying that there were 3 questions I've asked. I actually have a few more. And one of them is, and I typically get this via email or Facebook, somebody will say, what kind of tree is this? And they'll put up this fuzzy picture of a tree, and I was like, I don't know. Anybody want to hazard a guess about what kind of tree that is? Maple. I would have said maple, too. That's what I would have thought. We've actually labeled all these trees very carefully. That is actually a sweet gum, and they have those beautiful little prickly balls that fall from them. Those are maples. It's a sweet gum. It's sweet gum. More often, I'll get a fuzzy picture of a plant, and somebody will say, what is this? You probably can't see that very carefully. One day I came home from a field trip, and I had this little sprig of this scraggly thing in my hand, and then I turned to my wife and said, this is my favorite prairie grass. And she said, you have a favorite prairie grass? I said, yes, I do. And this is it. This is a knotroot bristlegrass. Isn't that a great name? Beautiful little plant. I actually dug this out from a thoroughfare, a public place. I went out with my little spade and dug this up, and I'm going to set up a little tiny prairie in my backyard.
Is that the same as what we know as a cattail?
It is not the same. The bristlegrass is very short, very fine little blooms. There are about 4 or 5 prairie grasses that are, they call them the Big Five. This is one of those. They encourage a lot of habitat, and they're very easy to grow, and that's one of the reasons. Bless you, I heard somebody sneeze. Okay, the other thing I'm often asked, what kind of critter is this? And that's usually easier, and you can look at that and say, well, it's got to be a toad. Well, specifically, this is the Gulf Coast toad, and that's how our chapter of Master Naturalists in Harris County is the Gulf Coast chapter, so this is our mascot. All right, the answers to those kinds of questions. First of all, I don't know these answers. Somebody says, what kind of tree, plant, critter? I don't know. What do? I look in a reference book, and I bought a whole grouping of reference books last fall. That one that says Trees of Texas, most amazing reference book I've ever owned. It shows life-sized leaves. That's where you find that sweet gum in there. You see it, and it just shows you what it looks like in different seasons. But I've learned about all kinds of insects and birds and wildflowers and butterflies and dragonflies. And while I'm on the subject of books, I want to talk a minute about this one because this kind of puts everything in perspective. This is one of those books I'd heard somebody mention early on in my training. Somebody said, you need to read Richard Louve's Last Child in the Woods. And notice the subtitle of this, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. Louve's contention is that we're losing our children's connection to the outdoor world. And so this book teaches you the value of it. All right, I am done if anyone has questions. Thank you.